Welcome back to another episode of Let's Overreact All Together, because after the end of this week, we are now done going through the first round of raid testing that happened this last weekend. And of course, with the raid testing being over, what we can now do is go and look exactly at how the specs performed in the raid. Once again, the useful part of this exercise is not to look at the specs and decide who is OP right now and who you have to reroll for in the next expansion, but rather to take a look at the state of the specs, perhaps pointing towards certain specs requiring some more attention compared to others, as well as getting a good idea, since this is a raid, of course, about the performance of the specs in single target. Then we might look, perhaps tomorrow, about the performance of the specs in a more AoE centric scenario, like for example Mythic Plus. That's also going to be quite the important activity in the next expansion, but for today we limit ourselves to the results that happened in the raid testing of this last weekend, starting first, of course, from the weakest of the performers. Obviously, let's just scrap the healers and the tanks in terms of the damage they are doing. It's not really that relevant. If we start looking at the performance of the DPS, what jumps to the eye immediately in the bottom 10 of the performers is that we have the entirety of the roster of rogues and the entirety of the roster of warriors. They were all amongst the worst of the performers right now. What makes this still relevant is that by switching to a different boss, even if we stay in the same similar single target category, the results are very similar still. The bottom 10 of the Bloodbound Horrors still includes the 3 rogue specs, still includes the 2 warrior specs, it also still includes Balanced Druid, Arcane Mage and Elemental Shaman. Now, some of the specs down here might be for different reasons. For example, Rogue and Deathstalker in particular are still quite bugged, and even Assassination itself is also quite bugged compared to, for example, Outlaw, who is working quite fine, which might not be a good thing considering the damage it's doing. Same goes for other specs, like for example Elemental, who does not really have anything particularly not working if we want to consider Farseer a fully working hero talent. That would be quite depressing. Same goes for Arms and Fury Warrior being quite okay working-wise right now, still not performing very well. This seems to be where we have the most agreements in, the bottom part of the results. The middle part becomes a bit more contested in certain choices. Some specs find themselves here on multiple bosses, like for example Frost Mage, like Devastation Evoker, Enhancement Shaman stay in here on multiple bosses. Others are going back and forth towards the better side of results or the middle pack side of results, depending on the bosses, like for example Beast Mastery Hunter, Frost DK, even Affliction Warlock and Shadow Priest being right at the edge before getting into the top 7, top 8 of the results in the raid testing so far. Now, we have mentioned something yesterday about being part of the top results in the raid, which for now the title goes at the moment to Fire Mage. Fire Mage has had the better results all around on average, even being ahead by a whooping 20-ish% compared to the second best, even almost doubling the damage of the ones lower down in the results, like a Sub-Rogue or an Elemental Shaman. Fire Mage right now in their Sun Fury build is doing very well. It is a different type of build, a build that ditches Sun King's Blessing for Unleashed Inferno, that has also gotten buffed in how much more damage your spells do inside of Combustion, and further reduces the Combustion cooldown even more, giving you some 40 to 50 second cooldown Combustion in your damage windows. You get even more uptime in your pseudo Combustion by using Hyperthermia, both in your talent tree, but also from the Sun Fury hero talent itself, giving you Hyperthermia. And at the moment, this is performing very well. Perhaps, the purpose of this testing is to show that it is performing a bit too well in terms of results. In terms of other good performers, we of course mentioned it yesterday, Warlock as a whole, in terms of a class, a DPS class, was the one doing the best in general, particularly Demo and Destruction, and also the other couple of specs we mentioned being Marksmanship and Retribution Paladin. The surprise though that we haven't mentioned, especially because they wouldn't strike you as some powerhouse single target names, are Windwalker, and Feral Druid. Windwalkers are playing right now with the conduit of the Celestial Hero talent, giving them the Celestial Conduit 90-second cooldown, and even on single target, which isn't their normally known point of power, has actually been doing quite well in the beta testing so far. The other group of specs doing well was Enhancement, which was right at the edge between being in the top 10 or not in this testing, as well as the DK specs, both Unholy and Frost. Frost right now playing with the Rider of the Apocalypse talent, but more importantly Unholy at the moment playing Sun Lane. They are getting, let's just say, swarmed with resources, endless amount of resources, giving them tons of damage in this current version of their build. It does also line up quite well with the style of Unholy, since the gift of the Sun Lane buff lines up with Dark Transformation, and it can also give you a whole lot of haste, which is also something Unholy DKs are quite fond of when they are trying to bash their buttons inside their cooldowns. This hero talent right now is working quite well for the spec. These results right now, as mentioned, are quite useful to try to give an idea to players, but of course more importantly to Blizzard, on how the specs are functioning right now, especially as they, juggle between one or the other hero talents at their disposal and see how they are performing in the raid. And also, as we will see as well eventually in Mythic Plus, what is the performance of the different builds of the specs right now, since, there is still quite a lot of time left to tune any of these problems. And of course, it's also a good time for players to let themselves completely fall into despair and depression as they see their specs not doing well right now. Like, all of the rogue specs or elemental or balance not really doing particularly well right now. It can vary. Sometimes the spec, not only is it doing poorly, but also the rotation doesn't feel nice. It feels clunky, or it feels too slow or disconnected and disjointed, like for example elemental. Even if they try to play with Lightbringer and with the lightning style build, it still feels awful to play. Even if you were buffed and you actually started doing non-tank damage, it will still feel quite bad. Meanwhile, Outlaw, for example, who is doing poorly, but their rotation still feels like the ADHD 80 APM style of build, even if nowadays Killing Spree is making a comeback in their rotation, which might possibly slow you down a bit. The rotation as a whole still feels nice and smooth, it's just that the damage itself has not caught up to be competitive. Complete opposite of Assassination, for example, who not only has a pretty poor damage right now, but also the rotation itself, even worse in the biggest problem of Assassination, Mythic Plus, AoE damage, is also having problem on that front, not just on the actual damage of the spec. The same we could say towards the top, specs that are currently doing top damage right now. Okay, fine, are they doing top damage because a particular talent or a particular ability is broken OP, and the only reason you were enjoying the spec was because of their top damage, and the moment they get nerfed, you go back to complaining about how bad they play? A good example, since we already talked about them, are the Warlock specs. Even if Destruction and Demo were to be tuned down, for example by nerfing Wither, for example by nerfing the Overfiend for Destro, the specs themselves would still continue to play quite nicely, even if they were to be nerfed a little bit in their damage. Meanwhile, on the other hand, you can have something like Marksmanship, which hasn't changed much in the buttons they are pressing and in how they play, meaning that if you weren't enjoying Marksmanship doing bad damage before, you're not going to magically enjoy Marksmanship because it's doing good damage now. So what happens once Marksmanship damage gets nerfed, or Sentinel more likely, the hero talent, gets nerfed, then you go back with having the same problems about Marksmanship. But overall, it is still a good thing to be checking out on these results this early. We also have a pause now of a couple of weeks before we get to do any raid testing again, so maybe perhaps in between these two sets of raid testing we will get more balance tuning. That would be ideal, so we get to compare the results of the specs now with the changes for the next raid testing to see how it affected each of the specs. But for today though, on this Monday, that is all we have for the recap on how the raid testing went in the beta this weekend. So with this out of the way, we are now leaving each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, to everyone who has supported for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's getting quite tight. I need to go out, shop for some groceries, come back, take a shower, and be in time to raid in about 80 minutes.